May 8, 1945, near Cuxhaven, Germany. The rifle butt struck weathered oak 3 times. Sharp cracks that sent splinters drifting through dawn's half-light like ash from a dead world. In the farmhouse cellar, Margarete Schneider pressed her spine against cold plaster, breathing shallow gulps that tasted of mildew and terror. 23 years old, 6 days since her last real meal. The Gray Signals auxiliary uniform hung from her shoulders like burial cloth, fabric worn through at the elbows from 2 years of wartime service transmitting messages for a regime that had just collapsed into history's dustbin. If this story hasn't reached you yet, you're part of the majority. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Because what unfolded in the hours and days after Germany's surrender revealed a chapter of the prisoner of war experience that textbooks still struggle to categorize. What happened challenged everything these women believed about enemies, about humanity, about the architecture of hate that had been carefully constructed in their minds since childhood. Outside the cellar, boots scraped gravel. Male voices speaking clipped English punctured the morning air. Then louder, "Out! Everyone out now!" The war was over. Everyone knew it was over. But Margarete Schneider had been trained to expect brutality from the Allied forces, trained through propaganda films, through whispered stories, through years of systematic dehumanization of the enemy. What she wasn't trained for, what none of them were prepared for, was the possibility that their captors might treat them like human beings. 6 weeks earlier, Margaret had occupied a bunker near Bremen, transcribing encrypted radio traffic under stuttering bulbs that made her eyes ache. She was good at the work, fast, accurate, unbothered by tedium that drove other auxiliaries to resignation. Her father had been a school teacher before everything burned, a quiet man who taught her to love order and systems. She joined the Nachrichtenhelferinnen in 1943, not from ideological fervor, but because the alternative was a munitions factory floor, and because the uniform promised regular meals. By April 1945, regular meals were archaeological artifacts from a different civilization. The Allied advance had been swift and absolute. British forces swept across the northern plains like floodwater, and what remained of the Wehrmacht dissolved before them. Margaret's signals unit received evacuation orders on April 20th, then counter orders, then silence. The commanding officer gathered them in the mess hall one gray morning and delivered truth in a voice scraped raw. The roads are blocked. Transport has been requisitioned. You are to destroy sensitive materials and disperse. God help you. Some women wept. A few tried to flee westward on foot. Margaret stayed because there was nowhere to go. Her family's home in Hamburg was ash, swallowed by the firestorm of July 1943 that killed 40,000 in a single night. She had a cousin in Lübeck, maybe. Instead, she walked to the farmhouse where she'd sometimes traded cigarette rations for eggs, where Frau Kessler let her sleep in the cellar and brought thin potato soup and told her to stay quiet, stay hidden, wait for the soldiers to pass. The soldiers did not pass. They came at dawn with rifles and lists and canvas-topped trucks. The British sergeant who hauled open the cellar door was younger than Margaret expected, mid-20s with a sunburned nose and eyes the color of winter steel. He didn't point the rifle at her. He just looked and said something in English she couldn't parse. Then slower. Raus. Schnell. She climbed the cellar stairs on legs that felt like water, emerged into a morning so brilliant it felt obscene. Spring had come in defiance of everything, apple blossoms frothing white against sky so blue it hurt to look at. Outside, 15 women stood in a loose cluster near the stone wall, all wearing Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, gray and field green and Luftwaffe blue. Some were barely 18, others were 30 or more, with hard lines around their mouths, and the blank exhaustion of women who had survived too much. A corporal with a clipboard was checking names. Another soldier was handing out canteens of water. Margaret took the canteen when it was offered. Her hands shook badly. The water tasted clean, faintly metallic, better than anything she'd drunk in months. She drank too fast and choked, and a voice beside her said softly, "Langsam, slow, you'll make yourself sick." The woman was older, maybe 35, with dark hair and the insignia of a medical auxiliary. Her name was Annalisa. She'd been a nurse in a field hospital. "They're processing us," British forces. We'll be transported to a holding camp. Don't resist, it'll go easier. What will they do to us? Margaret asked. Annalisa didn't answer immediately. She looked at the British soldiers, young men smoking cigarettes and talking. One of them laughed at something, a brief bright sound. I don't know, Annalisa said finally. But we're alive. Start there. They were loaded onto trucks and driven west for hours through countryside pocked with craters. Margaret sat wedged between Annalisa and a girl named Ilse, who couldn't have been more than 17, and who cried silently the entire journey. No one spoke much. The engine roar swallowed conversation. Through gaps in the canvas, Margaret caught glimpses of British convoys heading east, tanks on rail cars, tent cities sprawling across meadows. They stopped once for 10 minutes. The soldiers let them climb down to relieve themselves in the roadside ditch, a humiliation made worse by the casual indifference of guards who simply turned their backs and smoked. When they climbed back into the truck, one of the British soldiers, a boy really freckled and gap-toothed, offered Margaret a piece of chocolate. She stared at it. A small brown square wrapped in waxed paper. Cadbury's. He pushed it toward her again, nodding. Go on. It's all right. Margaret took it. The chocolate was soft from his pocket's warmth. She unwrapped it slowly, aware that every woman was watching, and bit into it. The sweetness hit her tongue like electricity. Rich, creamy, almost unbearably intense after months of ersatz rations. She chewed slowly, eyes burning, and the British boy smiled and climbed back to his position at the tailgate. Annalisa leaned close. They're not what we were told, she whispered. Margaret swallowed the chocolate. It stuck in her throat like truth too large to digest. No, she said. They're not. The processing camp was a converted airfield in Lower Saxony. They arrived after dark, exhausted, and were herded into a long wooden barracks, lit by electric bulbs that glowed steady and white. No flickering, no rationing. It had been so long since Margaret had seen unrationed electric light that she stood blinking like an animal dragged from a cave. British women soldiers were waiting inside, members of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. They wore crisp khaki uniforms and looked impossibly clean, impossibly healthy. They gestured the German women toward long tables where they checked names, examined papers, asked questions through interpreters. One of them, a broad-shouldered woman with graying hair and kind eyes, paused when she reached Margaret and said something. The interpreter translated, "She wants to know if you need medical attention." Margaret shook her head. She wasn't injured, just hungry, just tired, just hollowed out. The woman didn't look convinced. She reached into a bag and pulled out a thick wool blanket, clean, dark green, smelling faintly of soap, and held it out. Margaret took it automatically. The blanket was heavy, real, warm. The British woman smiled and moved to the next woman without ceremony. That night they slept in bunks with thin mattresses and the blankets they'd been given. The barracks were crowded but heated, actual heat from a coal stove. Someone had left buckets of clean water near the door. Margaret lay awake for a long time, blanket pulled to her chin, listening. Women weeping, women whispering, Ilse's ragged breathing above. Outside, a gramophone was playing somewhere. American swing. Glenn Miller, maybe. She knew the sound from before the war, from when her father tuned the radio to forbidden foreign stations late at night. She pulled the blanket tighter and felt something inside her chest crack open just a little. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. The ship that carried them to England was a converted hospital vessel, white-painted with enormous red crosses on the hull. They boarded at Cuxhaven on a gray morning in mid-May, shuffling up the gangplank while gulls screamed overhead and salt and diesel choked the air. Margaret had never been on a ship before. The scale awed her, the massive hull, the web of rigging, the sense of barely contained power thrumming through the deck plates. The crossing took 2 days. Margaret spent most of it on deck when allowed topside, gripping the rail and watching the North Sea roll past in shades of gray and green. The water was hypnotic, endless. She'd grown up landlocked, had never seen the ocean except in propaganda newsreels. Now she was crossing that same water as a prisoner, heading toward a country she'd been taught to think of as an enemy stronghold. Annalise found her at the rail on the second morning. The older woman looked better, had washed her face and hair, borrowed a comb from one of the British nurses. "How are you managing?" "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Margaret admitted. "They feed us, they give us blankets. The British nurses are kind, but we're prisoners, we lost. Our country—" She stopped. "Our country lied to us," Annalisa said quietly. She was staring out at the water. "I've been thinking about that. All the things they told us about the British, the Americans. Monsters, subhuman, degenerate. Look around, Margaret. Does this look like what they described?" It didn't. It looked like ordinary people doing ordinary work. Soldiers who joked and offered cigarettes. Nurses who checked on the sick and handed out seasickness tablets without judgment. It looked like decency. "What do we do with that?" Margaret asked. Annalisa smiled, but it was a sad smile. "We survive it," she said. "And then we figure out who we are afterward." They landed at Southampton on a morning wrapped in fog. British soldiers were waiting, but so were women from the Red Cross with tea urns and sandwiches. Actual sandwiches with white bread, butter, cheese. Margaret ate hers standing on the dock, tasting salt air and butter and sharp English cheese, and thought, this is what abundance looks like. From Southampton, they were taken by train to a camp in the countryside. The journey took most of the day. Margaret watched England scroll past. Green fields impossibly lush, hedgerows thick with blossom, villages that looked untouched by war. Stone cottages intact, church spires without a trace of damage. It was surreal. Obscene almost. This normalcy when Germany was rubble and ash. The camp was outside Much Wenlock in Shropshire, a cluster of Nissen huts surrounded by wire fencing. But the fencing was low and the gate was guarded by only 2 bored-looking soldiers. Inside, the huts had iron stoves, rows of beds with actual mattresses, shelves for belongings. The latrines were separate buildings with running water, cold but clean. There was a mess hall, a medical hut, even a recreation room with a piano and German books. The camp commandant, a British major with thinning hair and a slight stammer, addressed them through an interpreter on their first evening. "You are prisoners of war, and you will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will work light duties, nothing hazardous, and in return you will receive rations, medical care, and fair treatment. Any abuse will be reported and punished. You have my word." Margaret listened with her arms crossed, still waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. It never did. The pivot came 3 days later at breakfast. They were issued rations each morning: porridge with milk, bread, margarine, sometimes jam, tea, with real sugar. More food than Margaret had seen in months. She was sitting at one of the long tables, spooning porridge mechanically when one of the British guards, a sergeant with red hair and a thick Yorkshire accent, stopped beside her with a bar of chocolate. "Here," he said in rough German. "For you." She stared at it. "Why?" He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "You're thin as a rail, love. And it's your birthday, isn't it? Saw it on your papers. 23 today." Margaret had forgotten her own birthday. May 15th. She was 23 and she'd forgotten. The sergeant placed the chocolate on the table, Hershey's, American made, the wrapper bright silver, and walked away before she could respond. She picked up the bar with shaking hands. Annalisa, sitting across from her, was watching with wide eyes. Ilse whispered, "Mein Gott, ein..." Margaret unwrapped the chocolate slowly. The smell hit her first. Sweet, rich. She broke off a square and put it in her mouth. The taste flooded her senses. Sugar, cocoa, cream. She chewed slowly, then faster, and then she was crying, tears streaming down her face while she ate the chocolate in desperate bites, the sweetness mixing with salt. Annalise reached across the table and gripped her hand. "It's all right. Let it out." But it wasn't all right. Nothing was all right. Because if the enemy could be kind, if they could remember your birthday, hand you chocolate, treat you like a human being. Then what did that make you? What did that make everything you'd believed? Margaret finished the chocolate and pressed her palms against her eyes. When she finally looked up, Annalisa was still holding her hand, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. We were lied to, Margaret said. Yes, Annalisa said. We were. Daily life settled into a rhythm that felt bizarrely normal. They woke at 6 to the sound of a bell, washed in the ablution block, queued for breakfast. Work assignments were posted on a board: kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning, gardening. Margaret, because of her signals training, was put to work in the camp office helping process paperwork. The British corporal who supervised her, a soft-spoken man named Davies, treated her with distant courtesy, offering tea in the mornings and correcting her English with patient good humor. He had a photograph of his family pinned above his desk. A tired-looking woman and 3 small children in front of a brick house. Once Margaret asked about them. Davies's face softened. That's my Elsie, and the little ones, Tom, Mary, and Susan. Haven't seen them in 2 years. War, in it? She thought about that conversation for days. Davies missed his family. He was tired of the war. He was just a man doing a job, waiting to go home. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't even particularly heroic. He was just ordinary. It was the ordinariness that undid her, piece by piece. In late June, the camp held a summer festival. The German women viewed it with suspicion until the British soldiers set up tables and began grilling sausages and handing out bottles of beer. There was music from a gramophone. A few of the braver women, emboldened by the beer and warm evening, began to dance with each other, awkward and giggling. Margaret sat on a bench with Annalisa and Ilse watching. Ilse was 16, they'd learned, not 17. She'd lied about her age to join the Signals Corps. She was still a child, really, with a child's capacity for wonder. She watched the dancing with bright eyes and said, I haven't heard music like this since before the war. A British soldier, Private Collins, one of the younger guards, approached with 3 bottles of beer dangling from his fingers. He offered them with a shy smile. Ladies? They took the bottles. The beer was warm and bitter and wonderful. Collins sat on the grass nearby, not intruding, but present. After a while, Ilse asked him haltingly where he was from. Leeds, he said. Up north. Rainy. Cold. But home, you know? They talked for nearly an hour, Ilse's English improving as she relaxed. Collins told them about his mother's bakery, about his younger brother who'd been killed at Normandy, about how much he hated army food. He asked about their families, what Germany had been like before the war. He listened when they talked. He didn't judge. When the evening ended, Ilse hummed a gramophone tune as they walked back to their hut. Margaret watched her, this girl child rebuilding from ruin, and felt something shift inside her. The possibility of hope. From her diary, July 10th, 1945. We were taught to see devils where there were only men. Tired men. Homesick men. The British sergeant gave me his jacket when I was cold. Take my jacket, Margaret, he said, as if I were a person. I cried when I put it on. What does it mean that the enemy is kind? That jacket, wool, too large, British Army issue, became a symbol. By August, propaganda had collapsed. The British weren't starving or abusing them. They offered food, medicine, and dignity. When one soldier crossed the line, he was punished, not excused. The truth dismantled everything Margaret had believed. At Christmas they sang Silent Night together, British and German voices blending in the dark. For a moment, there was no war, only people hoping for light. Margaret returned to a shattered Germany in 1946, carrying memories she could never explain. The chocolate, the kindness, the enemy's compassion. She rebuilt, learned English, and later moved to London, marrying a man who understood unspoken wounds. She raised daughters to question authority, to see humanity even in those called enemy. In 2024, her jacket and diary appeared in the Imperial War Museum. One line was enlarged on the wall. What does it mean that the enemy is kind? Visitors stood before it, realizing that kindness can shatter hatred's foundation. Margaret spent her life proving that mercy, once given, cannot be unlearned. The war ended in 1945, but the real battle, the one for understanding, endures. Because when the enemy is kind, it means we're all human, and that changes everything.